Eleanor Heaton had spent most of the evening pretending to read. The book, resting open upon her lap, was, by any reasonable standard, an excellent one. It had been a gift from Charles during the first year of their marriage, purchased after she had spent several weeks dropping increasingly unsubtle hints whenever they passed a bookseller's window. Under different circumstances, she would probably have finished several chapters by now. Instead, she had reached the same page 3 separate times, and could not afterwards have recalled a single sentence. The fault lay not with the author, Charles Dickens, but that was another story. It lay with the clock upon the mantelpiece. Every few minutes her eyes found themselves drawn back to it, unconsciously checking how much farther the brass hands had crept. Beyond the drawing-room windows, rain swept across Belgrave Square and blurred the lamps outside into pale golden smudges against the darkness, while somewhere further away, carriage wheels hissed through wet streets as London settled gradually towards night. It was approaching midnight, and Charles was late. Ordinarily she would not have minded. Her husband was a busy man, and busy men rarely belonged entirely to themselves. The rapid expansion of Britain's railways had created opportunities for ambitious solicitors, and few young solicitors were more ambitious than Charles Heaton. Business dinners became meetings, meetings became negotiations, and negotiations frequently stretched far beyond the hour at which they had originally been expected to conclude. Tonight, however, she found herself glancing towards the clock with increasing impatience, not because she was worried, and not because she was annoyed, simply because she was carrying a secret and had reached the point where keeping it felt almost physically uncomfortable. But he was later than she expected. A smile appeared despite herself. For most of their 3 years of marriage, she had considered herself reasonably capable of maintaining surprises. This one, however, was proving difficult. The sound of rain against the windows drew her attention briefly back towards the square outside, and for a moment she found herself remembering the evening when she had first met Charles. It had happened at a dinner party, so thoroughly ordinary that neither of them would have remembered it at all, had the rest of their lives not followed. Eleanor would recall remarkably little about the menu, or the flowers decorating the table, which is unusual given that Eleanor lived for the thrills of a dinner party. What she did remember was a young man seated several places away, who somehow managed to charm an elderly colonel, disagree with a member of Parliament, and make her laugh twice before dessert. Her mother had later described him as devilishly handsome. Her father had described him as driven like a steam train. As it turned out, both assessments had been correct. At 24 years of age, Charles possessed the sort of easy confidence that drew attention whenever he entered a room. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and quick to smile, he moved through society with an assurance that suggested the future had already agreed to cooperate with him. Yet beneath the charm, there existed genuine intelligence and determination, qualities that had helped transform a promising young solicitor into a remarkably successful one. Not that success had been the reason she married him. She had married him because life felt brighter whenever he was present. Charles possessed the rare gift of making her feel as though she were the only person in the room worth listening to, and somewhere between long conversations and stolen afternoons she had fallen completely and rather happily under his spell. Her whole life was rosy with him in it. He fascinated her, and she welcomed it. Even now, after 3 years together, she still found herself listening for his footsteps. The front bell eventually sounded shortly before 1 a.m., and Eleanor's attention abandoned the book entirely. Through long familiarity, she recognized the sequence that followed almost without thinking. The door would be opened. A servant would relieve Charles of his coat and hat. There would be a brief exchange of words in the hall, and then, a minute or two later, she would hear his footsteps approaching. It was a routine so ordinary that she barely noticed it most evenings. But tonight, every second seemed to take far longer than it should. She didn't know whether to sit or stand. She was so fidgety. Downstairs, Mrs. Finch happened to be crossing the hall when the maid opened the door, and although the housekeeper made no show of watching, she noticed at once that Mr. Heaton appeared later than usual, and rather more disordered than his wife was likely to see. Not drunk exactly, and certainly not incapable, but damp from the rain, pale around the mouth, and impatient in that quiet way gentlemen sometimes became when they wished servants to vanish without actually dismissing them. He thanked the maid for taking his coat, asked that no one sit up unnecessarily, and began making his way to the drawing-room before Mrs. Finch had finished giving instructions about the morning fires. It was not much. In a house like that, servants noticed such things constantly and mentioned them rarely. When Charles entered the room, Eleanor's first feeling was relief, followed almost immediately by affection. He looked tired, certainly, and the rain had darkened the ends of his hair where it had escaped beneath his hat. But tiredness was hardly unusual now. Railway dinners, investment meetings, and legal consultations often left him looking as though half the city of London had been carried home upon his shoulders. "You are late," she said, though there was no reproach in it. Charles smiled as he crossed the room, and if the smile arrived a fraction later than usual, Eleanor was too full of her own news to notice. He kissed her cheek and lingered beside her chair for a moment, perhaps longer than he intended, as though the warmth of the room, the fire, and the sight of his wife waiting there offered him a version of himself he badly needed to recover. "I am sorry. The evening ran on longer than expected." His eyes lingered on the fire rather than meeting hers. "With railway men or exhibition men? Is there any difference left?" Eleanor laughed softly, pleased to hear the familiar dry amusement in his voice. He poured himself a little brandy from the decanter near the sideboard, though not much, and stood for a while with the glass in his hand rather than drinking from it. She noticed then that one of his cuffs was slightly frayed, as though something had caught at it. But before the observation had time to trouble her, he turned back towards her with the expression she knew so well. Attentive, charming, and entirely present. "You look as though you have been waiting to tell me something," he said. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the book on her lap, suddenly shy now the moment had arrived. She had imagined telling him several times during the evening, sometimes calmly, sometimes laughing, sometimes with her hands in his. But now that he stood before her, the words seemed both enormous and strangely simple. "I have had news today," she said. Charles set the brandy down without drinking it. "Good news, I hope." "I believe so." He came closer then, and Eleanor saw concern pass briefly across his face. It touched her more than she expected. Whatever ambition lived in Charles, whatever hardness he carried into business, she believed there remained in him a tenderness reserved for her and her alone. "I sent for Dr. Pembroke this afternoon," she continued, "because I had begun to suspect something, and did not want to tell you until I had more than my own foolish hopes to offer." Charles became very still. For a moment Eleanor thought he had not understood. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, not with the loud delight some men might have performed for a drawing-room, but with a sudden softening that made him look younger than he generally allowed himself to appear. All the cleverness and calculation seemed to fall away from his face, leaving only astonishment and a kind of vulnerable happiness she had rarely seen there. "Eleanor," he said quietly. She smiled properly then, because the way he spoke her name told her everything she needed. "Dr. Pembroke says it is early yet, and that one must not become too excited too soon, although he said this while smiling in a manner that made such advice impossible to obey." Charles crossed the remaining distance between them and took both her hands, and, although he had returned home carrying more darkness than Eleanor could possibly have imagined, in that instant his happiness was real. He wanted the child. He wanted the future that came with it. He wanted the family, the name, the legacy, the visible proof that everything he had built was now anchored to something beyond his own ambition. "My darling girl," he murmured, and drew her gently to her feet. For several minutes they remained beside the fire, speaking quietly of possibilities. Eleanor wondered whether it would be a boy or a girl, and Charles, though he tried to pretend otherwise, could not entirely conceal the old expectation that every man of his kind carried somewhere inside him, the hope of a son. Yet when Eleanor teased him about it, he answered quickly that a daughter would be just as welcome, and because she loved him, she believed him. They spoke of the room upstairs that might become a nursery, of whether her mother should be told at once or made to wait until Christmas, of what Uncle Knocker would say when he heard. At that Charles laughed more freely than he had done all evening, declaring that his uncle would treat the unborn child like a railway company, requiring immediate investment. "He will have the baby's future mapped out before it can lift its own head," Eleanor said. "He will have it mapped out before morning if we're foolish enough to tell him tonight." The idea delighted her. It delighted him too. And for a little while the room contained only the ordinary happiness of a young married couple imagining a future neither had yet learned to fear. Mrs. Finch, passing the drawing-room door later with the discreet step of a woman who knew how to move through occupied houses without appearing to intrude, heard Eleanor laughing and allowed herself the smallest smile. She was not sentimental by nature, but she liked Mrs. Heaton, and approved of happiness when it did not make extra work for the servants. Still, as she continued towards the stairs, she found herself remembering Mr. Heaton's face when he had entered the house, and the hurried way he had removed one glove before letting the maid take his coat. There had been something strained about him, something not quite accounted for by weather or lateness. Much later, after the lamps had been extinguished, and the house had settled into the deep silence that comes only in the small hours of the morning, Eleanor found herself awake. The excitement of the evening had made sleep difficult. Every time she closed her eyes, her thoughts drifted towards the future and all the possibilities that now seemed to stretch before them. Eventually, unwilling to lie awake any longer, she slipped quietly from the bed and crossed to the window. The rain had finally stopped. Moonlight silvered the rooftops beyond the glass, while Belgravia slept beneath a thin veil of mist. Behind her, Charles remained asleep. She wondered how long she had laid there. His waistcoat hung over the back of a nearby chair, where he had left it before retiring for the night, and she crossed the room intending to find his watch. Her hand searched the pocket automatically before she realized it was not there. For a moment she frowned. The watch had been her wedding gift to him 3 years earlier, and she could not remember seeing him without it. But Charles had always possessed a talent for misplacing things. No doubt it would turn up in a desk drawer or beneath a pile of papers before the week was out. With that reassuring thought, she climbed back beneath the blankets and eventually drifted into sleep. By morning the news of Mrs. Heaton's condition had somehow reached the servants' hall, and whatever small curiosity the missing watch might have inspired was immediately overwhelmed by a far happier subject. The cook announced that she had suspected it for days, though nobody believed her. The parlour-maid hoped it would be a girl because girls' baby clothes were prettier. The housemaid hoped it would be a boy because gentlemen were less fussy as children, which caused immediate disagreement from everyone who had ever served in a house with boys. Mrs. Finch put an end to the discussion by reminding them that speculation did not polish silver, but even she could not entirely suppress the brightness the news had brought into the house. Uncle Knocker arrived the following afternoon and made enough noise for 3 visitors. His cane announced him first, striking the hall floor with its usual confidence as he removed his coat and demanded to know why everyone looked pleased with themselves. Eleanor came downstairs to greet him, and Charles told him the news in the drawing-room, with the air of a man presenting a successful venture. For perhaps the first time Eleanor could remember, Uncle Knocker said nothing at all for several seconds. Then his face altered. "Well," he said, tapping the silver head of his cane lightly against the carpet, "that is the first sensible thing either of you has done all year." Eleanor laughed, and Charles protested that he had done several sensible things that year, most of them profitable. Uncle Knocker ignored him completely and began speaking almost at once of nurseries, physicians, trustees, schooling, and the importance of ensuring that children understood money before they were old enough to be ruined by it. "If it is a boy," he said, turning to Charles, "he should learn railways before Latin." "And if it's a girl?" Eleanor asked. "Then she should learn both and frighten every dull man she meets." That answer pleased Eleanor more than she expected, though Charles merely smiled and poured his uncle a drink. It was then, between the brandy and the talk of schooling, that Uncle Knocker first mentioned the shares. He had been considering for some time, he said, what should be done with certain railway interests he had acquired early and cheaply, interests that were now proving rather more valuable than several fools had predicted. If Charles produced a child with brains, and Uncle Knocker emphasised that this remained an essential condition, he intended to see that the child benefited from them upon reaching adulthood. Charles looked amused at first, then thoughtful. "You are serious." "I am generally serious when money is involved." Eleanor rested a hand unconsciously against her stomach. "You're speaking as though the poor thing has already passed an examination." "Life examines us all soon enough," Uncle Knocker replied. "I merely prefer family members to have capital when it happens." In later years that conversation would matter more than anyone in the room understood. It would mean that baby Heaton, before he had even been born, already had a future being arranged around him by men who saw wealth not as comfort, but as movement. Shares, land, railway interests, and expectations began gathering around the unborn child like invisible furniture in a room he had not yet entered. In Belgravia, this was called provision. In Whitechapel, Sarah Partridge was still trying to decide how long she could keep her own secret hidden. The sickness had become harder to dismiss as the weeks passed. At first she blamed exhaustion, which was easy enough because exhaustion belonged so naturally to her life that nobody questioned it. She rose before dawn, worked until her back ached, carried water, washed linen, fed Frank and Ida, endured Tom's moods, and slept badly in a room where the noises of the tavern below rose through the floorboards long after midnight. Any woman living such a life had reason enough to look pale. Mrs. Doyle knew better. She had known from the first, though she allowed Sarah the dignity of arriving at the truth slowly. The older woman had delivered too many children and sat beside too many frightened mothers to mistake the signs. She watched Sarah turn away from food, pause too long on the stairs, grow suddenly faint beside the washtub, and touch her own stomach when she believed no one could see. One evening, when Tom had gone below and the children were asleep, Mrs. Doyle came upstairs with a little broth and shut the door behind her. "You can't pretend much longer," she said. Sarah sat near the window with her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I know." The simplicity of the answer made Mrs. Doyle sigh. There was no use scolding her, no use asking why she had not spoken sooner, and certainly no use pretending there were easy remedies for poor women carrying unwanted consequences. In Whitechapel, women learned quickly that the world expected them to bear what had been done to them, and then bear the blame for bearing it. "Does Tom suspect?" Sarah shook her head. "He will. I know that too." Below them, laughter rose from the tavern, followed by the scrape of chairs and the dull thud of something being dropped or thrown. Sarah flinched despite herself, and Mrs. Doyle's face hardened. "That man," she muttered. Sarah looked towards the fire. "He'll say it's his." "And will you let him?" "What else can I do?" It was not surrender in her voice so much as calculation. Tom was cruel, but he was her husband, and the world would count the child as his if she allowed it to do so. To say otherwise would destroy her faster than silence. No court would help her. No respectable household would believe her. No newspaper would print her name kindly. A gentleman might suffer embarrassment from accusation, if the accusation ever reached him at all. A woman like Sarah would suffer ruin. Mrs. Doyle knew it as well as she did. For a long while they sat together without speaking, the two women listening to the sounds of London pressing around the little room. The tavern beneath, the rain outside, the distant wheels passing through Flower and Dean Street, the unending murmur of a city that consumed private grief and never seemed full. At last Mrs. Doyle took Sarah's hand and held it firmly. "Then we get you through it." Sarah turned to her, and for the first time in weeks her composure cracked. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Mrs. Doyle said, not gently, but with absolute certainty. "Women always can when there's no one else to do it for them." Across London, Dr. Pembroke called again upon Eleanor, and pronounced himself satisfied with her progress. He was a calm man, not given to unnecessary drama, and his presence reassured the household precisely because he seemed so unimpressed by fear. Charles asked more questions than Eleanor expected. Practical ones, mainly about rest, diet, dangers, and whether her slight faintness in the mornings should concern them. Pembroke answered each in turn, before reminding him that childbirth was neither an engineering project nor a legal matter to be solved through sufficient attention. "Nature does not always submit itself to management, Mr. Heaton." Charles accepted the rebuke with reasonable grace, although Eleanor smiled behind her handkerchief. The months ahead stretched before the Heatons, filled with preparation. Lists were made, rooms considered, letters written. Eleanor's mother was informed, then several close friends. Then, by degrees, half of Belgravia seemed to know, as half of Belgravia usually did whenever something private occurred in a respectable house. Baby linen appeared. Advice arrived in alarming quantities. Older women who had previously ignored Eleanor suddenly became authorities upon diet, rest, confinement, midwives, nurses, and the mysterious dangers of draughts. Eleanor bore it all with patience, though not without humour. Charles, meanwhile, seemed to grow steadier after the news. Whatever restlessness had followed him home on the night she told him gradually disappeared beneath work, expectation, and the visible satisfaction of a man whose life now appeared to be arranging itself according to plan. He continued attending railway meetings, continued acquiring land for men who spoke of progress, as though progress had no victims, and continued returning each evening to a house where his wife waited with a future growing quietly within her. If he thought of Sarah Partridge, he gave no sign of it. Perhaps he had persuaded himself not to. Perhaps he had never needed much persuading. By winter, London had turned cold enough for frost to appear along window-sills before dawn. In Belgravia, fires burned early and often. Coal was delivered without anxiety, and Eleanor was encouraged to rest whenever she looked tired. In Whitechapel, coal was counted carefully. Blankets were shared, and Sarah worked until she could no longer hide the swelling beneath her dress. Tom noticed at last, on a bitter evening when gin had made him sharper rather than duller. He looked at her across the room above the black sail, and then down towards her stomach, and for one terrible second Sarah saw calculation move through his face. Not surprise exactly, not joy. Something meaner and more suspicious. "How long have you known?" Sarah kept her hands busy with mending. "A while." "A while?" She did not answer. Frank and Ida sat near the fire, both pretending not to listen. Children in such households developed that talent early. They heard everything while giving the appearance of hearing nothing. Tom leaned back in his chair, and laughed under his breath. "Well, ain't that fine?" Sarah's needle paused. "You've nothing to say?" "What would you like me to say?" "That it's another mouth?" The room chilled in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Sarah looked at him then, truly looked, and saw in his face not merely irritation, but resentment, forming ahead of time, as though the child had already wronged him simply by existing. He would claim it when convenient, despise it when angry, and use it against her whenever drink needed somewhere to pour its poison. "It's your child," she said quietly. Tom studied her. For a moment she thought he might challenge her. And then Ida coughed near the fire. Frank shifted uneasily, and the ordinary noises of the building rose again around them. Tom reached for his mug instead. "One child's hard enough. Two's a burden. Three's a bloody punishment." Sarah lowered her eyes to the mending and said nothing. Mrs. Doyle, hearing of the exchange later, said nothing for a long moment, and then crossed herself under her breath, though whether for Sarah, the unborn child, or the entire damn household, even she did not seem certain. As winter deepened, 2 pregnancies advanced through London in parallel, though the women carrying them might as well have lived in different countries. Eleanor's condition was discussed in drawing rooms with smiles, letters, and gentle warnings not to overexert herself. Sarah's was discussed in lowered voices beside washtubs, in Mrs. Doyle's back room, and occasionally in Tom's bitter remarks whenever money ran short. Eleanor was told to rest. Sarah was told to manage. Eleanor's child represented continuation, inheritance, and pride. Sarah's represented another mouth, another secret, another danger. And yet the children themselves knew nothing of such differences. They grew in darkness beneath the same London winter, while rain became sleet, fog thickened over the Thames, and the city moved restlessly towards another year. Above Belgrave Square, Eleanor lay awake some nights, smiling at the thought of the room upstairs that would soon become a nursery. Above the Black Sail, Sarah lay awake listening to Tom breathe heavily beside her, and wondering how much of a woman's life could be altered by a single night before the rest of the world even noticed. Yet the world notices more than people realise. Sarah had not noticed the boy sheltering beneath the archway near the Strand as she hurried through the rain. Had she seen him at all, she would have thought nothing of it. London was full of strangers, and she had passed hundreds of them in her lifetime without exchanging so much as a glance. But Felix Crossley had noticed her. And, although he could not have explained why, he found that he could not quite shake the image of the frightened young woman running through the darkness, as though the devil himself were at her heels.